This is the third video in a series on the Septuagint. If you haven't already, please see the introduction video. In this video, we will summarize the Old Testament books that are in the Septuagint but not in the Masoretic, look at notable additions within books in the Septuagint which are not in the Masoretic, look at some differences in the content of the two, and look at one problem with the Septuagint. Click here if you wish to jump to one of these sections. Throughout this video, even though I will call the extra content in the Septuagint additions, I am not implying that the extra content should not belong there. It is just as possible for the Septuagint to have additions as it is for the Masoretic to have subtractions. It is not the goal of this video to establish whether or not these books are inspired, canon, or if they belong in the Bible. The goal is merely to explain the history of these two manuscript families, the differences between them, and the beliefs of the early Christians who commented on the differences. Let's begin. While the Masoretic text contains 39 books, the Septuagint contains 62. Let's take a brief look at each of these additional books that are found in the Septuagint. First, Esdras. This is composed of the last two chapters of Chronicles, all of Ezra, a portion of Nehemiah, and a little more than 2 additional chapters. These 2 additional chapters give a backstory to Zerubbabel. They explain how Zerubbabel was one of King Darius of Persia's 3 bodyguards, how he and his other bodyguards had a contest with each other, how Darius declared Zerubbabel the winner, and how Darius sent him to become governor in Judea. These events occurred in March or April 520 BC and would be placed between Ezra chapter 1 and 2. Tobit. This story occurs around 680 BC, about 70 years after Jonah. It is about a Naphtali family who were taken into exile by the Assyrians and lived in the capital city of Nineveh. The main people in this story are the very righteous man, Tobit, his son, Tobias, who goes on a long journey, Raphael, an angel who guides Tobias through his journey, and Sarah, who marries Tobias. This is the only Jewish work from someone from the 10 northern tribes of Israel. The book of Tobit was very highly regarded by the early Christians because they referred to it or quoted it many times. The earliest writer to quote Tobit was Polycarp, a student of the Apostle John, who quoted 2 passages in his letter to the Philippians. Judith. This story is about Judith, an unmarried heroine who during a time of war entered the enemy camp and cut off the head of Nebuchadnezzar's general Holofernes. This took place during the time of the Assyrians, or the Babylonians, or the Persians. Dating this work is next to impossible. The people mentioned in the book were real people who lived anywhere within a 150-year window. In fact, the very first words of the book show a chronological problem. They read, "It was the 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled over the Assyrians in the great city of Nineveh." Of course, Nebuchadnezzar did not rule in Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrians whom he had conquered, but in Babylon. An obvious problem such as this, at the very beginning of a document that has survived with such popularity, might mean that the story was purposefully written as fiction. At least 7 early Christian writers appealed to Judith as a good example of a godly woman, but the book of Judith was never quoted by them. First, Maccabees. This historical book covers the Jewish revolts against the Greeks between the years 170 and 134 BC. It explains how the Greek Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes came to Jerusalem and desecrated the temple and made living by Jewish laws punishable by death. Then, a Levite family rose up and led the people in a practically miraculous revolt against the superior Greek armies. The book is named after a member of that family, Judas Maccabeus. After the Jews won the revolt, the temple was rededicated. This event may sound familiar because this holiday is celebrated every year and is called Hanukkah. Jesus celebrated this festival as recorded in John 10:22. At least 6 early Christians referred to 1st Maccabees. When considering both 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the early Christians often mentioned these books alongside other scriptures. In my opinion, they viewed them as genuine books of history. As a side note, Judas Maccabeus' family, known as the Hasmonean dynasty, ruled Judea until they were conquered by Herod the Great around 35 BC. 2nd Maccabees. Similar to 1st Maccabees, this book is another work describing the events surrounding the Greeks and Judas Maccabeus. 2nd Maccabees covers 185 to 160 BC. The book begins before 1st Maccabees and gives much more detail regarding the persecutions under Antiochus Epiphanes as explained in 1st Maccabees chapters 1 through 7. The author said that this work is an abridgment of a 5-volume work by Jason of Cyrene. Jason may have been a Greek, but he was probably a Hellenistic Jew. At least 4 early Christian writers refer to 2nd Maccabees, and it is quoted more often than 1st Maccabees, specifically chapters 6 and 7. These famous chapters are about 2 of the many martyrdoms of the Jews who willingly died horrific deaths during the genocide of Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BC. One was an elder named Eleazar, and the others were 7 brothers and their mother. The early Christians, namely Cyprian, looked to these martyrs and their unwavering commitment to God in the face of the most gruesome deaths imaginable as great examples of faith, because the Christians also faced horrific persecutions and sufferings at the hands of the Romans. 3rd Maccabees. This book is more like a prequel, occurring about 50 years before 1st and 2nd Maccabees. It describes the persecutions of the Jews under Ptolemy IV Philopator, the Greek king of Egypt, his genocide of the Jewish people, and how God divinely foiled his plan. Unlike 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the early Christians never referred to 3rd Maccabees. In the Apostolic Constitutions, Book 8, which is a post-nicene work, it says the biblical canon should contain 3 books of the Maccabees. We can assume it means 3rd Maccabees and not 4th Maccabees. Because of the chronology of the first 3 Maccabean books, the best way to read them is in reverse order. Psalm 151. The preface to this psalm reads, "This psalm is a genuine one of David, though it exceeds the usual number, composed when he fought in single combat with Goliath." The psalm is 7 verses long. The Prayer of Manasseh. This 1-chapter book is Manasseh's prayer, which he prayed after he repented of the very horrible sins he committed, which are recorded in 2 Chronicles 33, 1 through 16. The Prayer of Manasseh is usually included after 2 Chronicles 36, as the last chapter of 2 Chronicles. The prayer is fully quoted in the Apostolic Constitutions, Book 2, which dates to the 200s AD. Wisdom. This book's style is both poetic and prophetic. It has a strong emphasis on obedience and is rich in its teachings on the immortality of the soul. According to the Muratorian Fragment, a Christian document from around AD 170, this book was written by the friends of Solomon in his honor. Because of this, the book is often called Wisdom of Solomon. The early Christians highly regarded this book. It was quoted once and referred to once by Clement of Rome, who was a student of the apostles Paul and Peter. The book has many passages that are echoed in the New Testament. For example, there is imagery that was later used by Paul, such as the armor of God. In fact, wisdom appears to contain messianic prophecies that are fulfilled in the New Testament. Wisdom 8, 10, and 11 is a prophecy of Jesus as a young boy in the temple. It reads, "Because of wisdom, I shall give glory among the multitudes and honor in the presence of the elders, though I am young. I shall be found keen in judgment, and in the sight of rulers I shall be admired." And Wisdom 2, 17 through 20 is a prophecy of what Jesus' enemies said when they arrested and killed him. It reads, "Let us see if his words are true, and let us test what will happen at the end of his life. For if the righteous man is God's child, God will help him. and will deliver him from the hand of his adversaries. Let us test him with insult and torture, so that we may find out how gentle he is, and make trial of his forbearance. Let us condemn him to a shameful death, for, according to what he says, he will be protected. Sirach. This was written by Jesus, son of Sirach, a very learned Jewish teacher in Jerusalem around 195 BC, which dates prior to the Maccabees. Around 132 BC, his grandson translated it from Hebrew into Greek and added it to the Septuagint. The style of the book is very much like that of Proverbs. Sirach contains what seems like countless teachings that are repeated in the New Testament. In fact, it seems that a lot of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount could have already been found in Sirach. For example, Sirach wrote, "Do not seek to become a judge." Jesus builds upon this, saying, "Do not judge." Sirach also wrote, "Do not babble in the assembly of the elders, and do not repeat yourself when you pray." Jesus builds upon this, saying, "When you are praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard because of their many words." Sirach also wrote, "Fruit discloses the cultivation of a tree, so a person's speech discloses the cultivation of his mind." This is echoed by Jesus, saying, "A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. You will know them by their fruits. What comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles." And there are many more like these. Baruch. This book was written by Baruch, the servant of Jeremiah. The book places Baruch in Babylon about 5 years after the captivity in 582 BC. This would mean that after the destruction of Jerusalem, Jeremiah and Baruch went to Egypt. But Baruch made it to Babylon not long later, as the Lord had instructed them. The first half of the book is about Baruch's prayer to God that he sends back to the Jews in Jerusalem. There are some things in the first half of the book that raise questions about the book's authenticity. Interestingly, none of the early Christians quoted from the first half, but only from the second half. The second half reads very differently, as if the author was a prophet writing in the style of Proverbs or Job. This explains why at least 6 major early Christian writers quoted from the second half of the book of Baruch. Interestingly, the early Christians attributed the second half to either Jeremiah, a prophet, the words of God, or Scripture. There is only one quotation from the Apostolic Constitution's Book 5 that attributes it to Baruch himself. Lastly, there is at least one interesting connection between the New Testament and the second half of Baruch. Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 10:20, where he wrote, "They sacrifice to demons and not to God," is a quotation from Baruch 4:7. The letter of Jeremiah. The beginning of this letter reads, "A copy of the letter that Jeremiah sent to those who were taken to Babylon as exiles by the king of the Babylonians, to give them the message that God had commanded him." This places the book around the last destruction of Jerusalem, about 590 BC. Usually, this letter is found at the end of Baruch because Jerome placed it there when he translated the Latin Vulgate. Origen said the letter was the last chapter of Lamentations. He also said that it is one of the canonical books handed down by the Hebrews. The letter is 1 chapter long. It is a satire against idolatry. The Psalms of Solomon. These 18 psalms are not part of any official canon of Scripture today, but they have been found in the Greek Septuagint and the Aramaic Peshitta. The actual author of the psalms is unknown. They are called the Psalms of Solomon because Psalm 17 in this work is very similar to Psalm 72 in the Book of Psalms, which is attributed to Solomon. 4th Maccabees. Like the Psalms of Solomon, 4th Maccabees is not part of any official canon of Scripture today. It was written after 160 BC and probably before 70 AD. This philosophical book is about the greatness of reason over emotions. In the author's own words, "Now when God fashioned human beings, he planted in them emotions and inclinations, but at the same time he enthroned the mind among the senses as a sacred governor over them all. To the mind he gave the law, and one who lives subject to this will rule a kingdom that is temperate, just, good, and courageous. The author uses the incredible accounts of the martyrdoms from 2 Maccabees to prove his arguments about how reason overcomes emotions. The same philosophical rejection of emotions in favor of the human will was found in Stoicism. But instead of making secular arguments as a Stoic would have done, the author delivers a beautiful marriage between Stoicism and Judaism. Now let's look at books that have some notable additions within them. Genesis. About Genesis 1:8, Origen wrote, "In Genesis, the words, 'God saw that it was good,' when the firmament was made, are not found in the Hebrew, and there is a large dispute among the Jews about this." Take a look in your Bible and see if the second day is the only day where it does not say that it was good. But as Origen noticed, the phrase, "and God saw that it was good," is found in the Greek. Esther. There is much more material in Esther. It contains the full decrees, written by Haman and later by Mordecai, in which they wrote to the Persian Empire regarding the lawful murder and the lawful self-defense of the Jews. Very significantly, unlike the Masoretic version, which doesn't mention God a single time, the Septuagint version mentions God numerous times. Origen wrote, "Of the book of Esther, neither the prayer of Mordecai nor that of Esther, both fitted to edify the reader, is found in the Hebrew. Neither are the letters, the one written to Haman about the rooting up of the Jewish nation, nor that of Mordecai in the name of Artaxerxes delivering the Jewish nation from death." If these additions interest you, I recommend reading Esther's and Mordecai's prayers. They give an incredible glimpse into their holy personalities. Job. There are additions to Job. Origen noticed differences throughout Job and wrote, "Through the whole of Job, there are many passages in the Hebrew which are lacking in our copies, generally 4 or 5 verses, but sometimes even 14, 19, and 16. At the end of the book, the translator added a lot of information about Job and his family, giving a time frame of when Job lived. From the names given, it shows that Job was the 5th generation from Abraham and a descendant of Esau. And Job is the same person as Jobab in Genesis 36:33. From another angle, Moses was the 6th generation after Abraham, so Job was only about a generation older than Moses. The translator also explained that Job's wife was from Arabia. Daniel. Daniel contains 3 works within it: Susanna and the Elders, the prayer of Azariah and the song of the 3 holy children, and Bel and the dragon. The first is the story of Susanna, who is falsely blackmailed by 2 lustful elders. Daniel comes to her defense, and the elders are executed. This probably explains how Daniel became honored by the Jews and taken into the courts of the Babylonians. The second is a prayer of Azariah, also called Abednego, prayed while the 3 of them were in the fiery furnace. The third is a collection of 3 stories from when Daniel was a minister to the Persian king Cyrus the Great. 2 recount Daniel's contests against Persian idolatry and its priests. The third is either a retelling of Daniel in the lion's den, or is an event in which Cyrus had Daniel thrown into another lion's den. While in the den, strangely, God carries away Habakkuk by the Spirit to minister to Daniel there. Sextus Julianus Africanus wrote a letter to Origen saying that he believed the story of Susanna is a forgery and asked Origen about it. Origen disagreed, responding, "In answer to this, I have to tell you what is our duty in the cases not only of the history of Susanna, which is found in every Church of Christ in that Greek copy, which the Greeks use, but is not found in the Hebrew, or of the 2 other passages you mentioned at the end of the book containing the history of Bel and the dragon, which likewise are not in the Hebrew copy of Daniel. but there are also thousands of other passages which I found in many places when I was collating the Hebrew copies with ours with my little strength. Of the copies in my possession whose readings I gave, one follows the 70, and the other Theodotion. The history of Susanna, which you call a forgery, is found in both, together with the passages at the end of Daniel. Origen went into further detail on why he believed the Jewish scriptures do not have these additions while the Septuagint does. Click here to jump to that quote in the next video in the series on the Septuagint. Now that we have looked at the major additions, let's look at a few other major differences. The numbering of the Psalms are different. Psalm 10 and 11 in the Masoretic is a single psalm in the Septuagint. Psalm 147 in the Masoretic is given as Psalm 146 and 147 in the Septuagint. Thus, 138 of the 150 psalms are numbered differently between the two families. Hippolytus noticed the following about the use of Selah in the Psalms. Some Old Testament translations had Selah, while other translations had ever, as in forever and ever. As we have found in the 70, in Theodotion's, and in Symmachus translations, in many psalms the word diasalma is inserted. We endeavored to make out whether those who placed it there meant to mark a change at those places in rhythm or melody, or to mark any alteration in the method of instruction, thought, or language. However, this word is found neither in Aquila's translation nor in the Hebrew, but there, instead of diasalma, meaning an intervening musical symphony, we find the word ae, meaning ever. The Septuagint's version of Jeremiah is about a tenth shorter, and the order of events of Jeremiah is arranged differently. There is a link in the description that compares the order between them and lists the Septuagint's subtractions. One of the most fascinating differences is found right after David kills Goliath. Saul has hired David as his personal armor-bearer and harp player. Here, Saul is told that David's father is Jesse of Bethlehem. At the camp where Goliath is taunting the Israelites, David asks Saul if he could fight Goliath. Then Saul tries to dress David in his armor, but it wouldn't fit. Yet 15 verses later, as David is going out to fight Goliath, Saul asks his general who David is. And when David returns, David comes up to Saul, and Saul asks him who his father is. Why would Saul not recognize his own armor-bearer and harp player? Why would Saul ask who David is when he had just had a conversation with him about fighting Goliath? Why would Saul forget David's father when Saul had sent a letter to Jesse about hiring David? 1 Samuel 17:55-58 is a very confusing passage. It is found in the Masoretic, yet it is absent from the Septuagint. Therefore, the Septuagint's account about Saul and David is not confusing. About the age of King Ahaziah, Ahaziah's father was Jehoram. 2 Chronicles 21:20 in the New Revised Standard Version, which is the true translation of the Masoretic, reads, Jehoram was 32 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. Note that Jehoram was 40 years old when he died. Ahaziah was his son and succeeded him as king. 2 verses later, 2 Chronicles 22:2 reads, Ahaziah was 42 years old when he began to reign. Take a close look. How old was Jehoram when he fathered Ahaziah? If you do the math, Jehoram fathered his son Ahaziah at the age of 2, which is impossible. Yet this is the correct translation from the Masoretic text we have today. However, 2 Chronicles 22:2 in the Septuagint reads this way, Ahaziah began to reign when he was 20 years old. According to the Septuagint, Jehoram fathered Ahaziah at the age of 20, which is easily possible. To be fair, it is very possible that both the Masoretic and the Septuagint are corrupt, as 2 Chronicles 22:2. 2 Kings 8:26 gives a third age of Ahaziah, saying that he was 22 years old when he became king, putting Jehoram's age at 18 when he fathered him. Both the Masoretic and the Septuagint agree at 2 Kings 8:26. The fourth video in this series will explain why the Septuagint is a more reliable set of scriptures than the Masoretic. When it comes to these two families of manuscripts, it appears that the Septuagint is always superior to the Masoretic. But is there any passage in the Septuagint that cannot be genuine? I have found only one such passage. The genealogy from Adam to the flood in Genesis 5 is different. In fact, the years between the generations are different between all three manuscript families. Take a look at this graph. I have compared the Septuagint in blue, the Masoretic Text in yellow, and the Samaritan Pentateuch in green. The first set of columns are the years between Adam's birth and each person's birth. The second set of columns are the years between Adam's birth and each person's death. The third set of columns are the number of years from the person's birth until they fathered their firstborn. The fourth set of columns are the number of years from when they fathered their firstborn until their death. The last set of columns are the number of years that person lived. The problem with the Septuagint's genealogy is that it records that Methuselah died 14 years after the flood. Could Methuselah have been on the ark? No, because the Apostle Peter says the ark only saved 8 people. Therefore, the Septuagint's genealogies in Genesis 5 cannot be correct. Between the Masoretic and the Samaritan, which one of those is correct? First, if you look at the dates as to when each generation was fathered, the Samaritan Pentateuch is the most precise. Most of these men fathered their firstborn in their 60s. The Masoretic Text's pattern is not as consistent. For example, look at Jared through Lamech. Additionally, notice that the Samaritan Pentateuch says that Jared, Methuselah, and Lamech all died in the same year as the flood. Now that is a very interesting pattern. Because of the consistency and the preciseness of the Samaritan Pentateuch, perhaps it is correct. However, Josephus and the Peshitta agree with the Masoretic, so perhaps it is correct. So which one is correct? I do not know. Perhaps someone who has done more research can comment on this video. Back to the Septuagint, it is obvious that it is incorrect in Genesis 5. As far as I have found, this is the one and only problem with the Septuagint. However, the problem of when Methuselah died is not a sufficient reason to adopt the Masoretic Text over the Septuagint. For a mountain of evidence as to why the Septuagint is superior to the Masoretic overall, see the next video in this series, which will discuss differences in these manuscript families in light of the New Testament quotations from the Old Testament. Thank you for watching.